And if we are talking about sweet Regina going to China, you better believe that this fun video lecture is going to focus on China, the Mings and Qings in particular. That's 1368 now. Is that right? 1368 to 1644 to 1910. So 14th century to early 20th century in China. First, though, I think we need to take a look at what's happening in Europe at that very same time, and it's a period of dramatic change. If you could maybe stop the video for just a moment and think about, 1400 to 1800, how was Europe changing dramatically? And then we'll take a quick look at some of these. Well, we get the Renaissance. Now, did that dramatically change the lives of most Europeans? Of course not, but it did lead to an idea of individual scholars, thinkers, new ideas, maybe a slight movement away from just the purely church-based few elite people, etc. We certainly see with the Reformation, and that will become in the next unit in this class, Western Christianity has split between Catholics and Protestants. The printing press. Oh my goodness, that's in the 1430s, Johannes Gutenberg, and I can't overestimate how important this was. Information is spread widely, quickly, cheaply, etc. The Age of Exploration, well, good Lord. I mean, what more do we need to say about that? The way that it dramatically changes Europe in every possible way. The scientific revolution we'll look at in the next unit, but it's taking the printing press, the excitement that comes up through exploration, the new nation states that are forming that have more power, the idea of questioning of the Renaissance, and by golly, trying to figure out, can we really understand the physical world around us in a scientific way? Hey, gunpowder came from China, but the Chinese didn't use it as a weapon, beginning to staff the modern armies. Louis XIV had a standing army of tens of thousands of soldiers. The Enlightenment, well, again, we'll cover this in the next unit in this class, but it's basically taking the scientific revolution's ideas. Can we mathematically understand logically using educated reasoning the physical world around us? Can we apply it to societies? Can we apply this to human relations? The Enlightenment, certainly a major change in this period. The rise of nation states, as already mentioned, the idea that you've got a France, an England, a Portugal, a Spain, a Netherlands, and these folks are competing with each other, by the way, for scientific knowledge, to build bigger armies, to explore and take over and colonize, etc., etc. You start seeing, and you see this first in England and the Netherlands, but by the time we get to 1800, a republic in which the people vote for their representatives, the citizens, parliament, Congress, becomes more and more common. And by 1800, it's getting to be fairly understood as the way that Europe is going to go. Capitalism, we'll have to spend a lot more time on later, but the old mercantile idea of limited amounts of wealth and the state needs to control what people do commercially, well, that's been replaced by 1800, or is on the way to being replaced by individuals doing what they want to do with their money to make more personal profit. Now, the early Industrial Revolution in the 1700s, okay, by 1800, it hasn't created a dramatic difference in Western life, but by the end of the 19th century, oh my goodness, it is no longer the same world. And tied into all of this is the French Revolution that takes place in 1789. We've not talked about that. That'll be later in the school year, but all of these things collectively, Europe is a dynamic, changing place with competing nation states, and you don't see too much of this in China at the time. Again, geography-wise, China's civilization goes back, 3, 4, possibly 5,000 years, mainly the two major rivers, the Yangtze and the Yangtze River. Eventually, there are canals fairly early on connecting them, etc. Remember, though, that much of China's life is not arable. You can't grow crops on it. Well, rice terraces. The one thing China's always had a lot of is people who can do the physical labor and you can dig into a mountain, irrigate it, drop the rice plants, and by God, you can grow food on a rocky mountain. Pretty amazing sight. Now, this is modern day China. For most of China's history, it doesn't look anything like this. Now, by the end of the Qing Empire, it's pretty familiar. It's largely most of the territory in China. But for much of China's history, it's simply the eastern part of China between those two rivers. And we're so familiar with this, you might stop and remind yourself, what does the yin and the yang, what do they symbolize? Stop the video for a second. Again, an idea of cycles, of opposites in relation with each other. As you'll come to discover really going back to Judeo-Christian's world of you are good, and at the end there's a path, and you go to heaven, you go to hell. We certainly see this in Western political and scientific culture, that there is a sense of progress, of a linear nature of things. You don't see this in China. In China, you see these revolving cycles in which, sure, strength, the black, is great, yet within the strength is weakness. Within hot, we see the seed of cold. We can't understand big without understanding small. And of course, this relates to Chinese political and social and even religious spiritual practices. Yes, Confucianism, day, public, working with people, strict hierarchies, education, knowledge, but then there's Taoism with mystery, nature, magic, its private contemplation. It can't be put into words. What is China? Well, it's traditionally been both. We don't need to spend a lot of time on Confucianism, I don't think. We get the idea. Confucius goes back to about 400 or so BCE, and honestly, for about 2,300 years, this was the basis of Chinese society. Even today, Confucianism is officially not a part of the Chinese system, but after 2,300 years, you don't have a revolution in 1949 and Confucius is gone. Once again, this idea of strict social systems, people in their place, old over young, young over old, etc., etc. Dynasties follow this whole idea of the yin and yang. You have a family, they are assumed to have the mandate of heaven. You know all of this. If an empire is struggling, if a dynasty is starting to fall, if it's overthrown, well, clearly that emperor has lost the mandate of heaven and somebody new has taken on the right to rule. These dynasties lasted anything from 15, 20 years to many, many, many hundreds of years. One thing that's key is that there is a continuity. And even the couple of times that invaders have come in and taken over China, they didn't abandon Confucianism. They became, quote unquote, more Chinese than the Chinese, more Confucian than the Chinese, because it worked. It worked. Again, you've seen this many times. I won't stop and comment on it, but you might want to reacquaint yourself with the Chinese view. And you can just see a little yin and yang here, can't you? You can just see that cycle. So the three dynasties, China, the Han Dynasty, the Classical Area Dynasty collapsed around 220 CE. Then there was a very, very, very brief period, blink and you'll miss it, of about 370 years in which China is not particularly unified. There are local warlords and local lords and landowners in different parts of China controlled in competition and civil war, etc. Starting, I believe the year is 589, the Sui Dynasty takes over in China. They only last in about 20 years, but the continuation or the reunification of China is passed on then to the Tang Dynasty, about 600 to 900, the Song Dynasty, about 900 to 1279. Now, you will notice that 1200 is the starting point for AP World History, the exam, although certainly to understand anything about Chinese history, if you have no knowledge of Confucianism, of past history, it's not going to make a lot of sense without the context. And by the way, if you were to get a China question on one of the essays and you had to write about the context, potentially, if you're talking about early Song Dynasty and that's what the question is, Absolutely, you could consider perhaps Confucianism as context, or at least part of that. So for 3,000 years, China off and on wasn't always unified, but it was Chinese culture, Chinese writing, Chinese language, Chinese Confucianism. China, like many cultures, saw itself as the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom. The population, even back in the Tang and Song dynasties, dramatically exceeded all of Europe, and this is one unified country. As mentioned, you may get a question about technology. And you know what? Knowing an example would make sense. You get an SAQ about, oh my goodness, this is about early China. God, I got to oh, well, China had better technology. That's a reason. Great. Can you discuss a specific example? The compass. Printing, very important in China, but lesser so because there's no alphabet, so it didn't spread as much. Water power, using the power of water as early machines. Clocks, gunpowder, remember, mostly for display and not for military purposes. And huge canal technology. Giant canals connecting these two rivers that allowed transportation and food being moved from place to place, and army soldiers to keep order when necessary. Also, irrigation canals that allowed food to be grown in many other areas. Coming up with a specific, any one example where you can discuss it in a couple of sentences, that's going to score you an SAQ point. So we move on to the part of China that would be really the central focus of China in this course, because this is from 1200 to 1200 to 2001. A lot part of this time is taken up with the Mings and Qings, who happily rhyme. You'll see the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644. The Qing, also called the Manchu Dynasty, because these were not ethnic Chinese. They were Manchurians from the north for about 300 years to the 20th century. This, by the way, is a Ming Dynasty vase, or as we call it in the United States, a vase, but known for their porcelain work. You want to appear witty at some point. You could say, oh dear, I seem to have dropped my Ming Dynasty vase, and that suggests that you are a person of great wealth and artistic collection. By the way, this delightful haircut, and I'm thinking about making it mandatory for this class, this was called the Q, and this is how it was. The Manchus had worn their hair with the long braided ponytails shaved in the front. To the degree that they could, the Manchus actually required Chinese men to wear their hair like this. There was a saying at the time, it is better to shave one's head than lose one's head. And obviously that means the repercussions of saying, nuh-uh, were pretty severe. So you might recall that the Song dynasty ended in 1279. What happened in between them and the Mings? Well, there was another of the outside invaders, the Mongols. Oh, yes, the Mongols, who, again, adopted Confucianism. They called themselves the Yuan dynasty. Now, when the Mings take over, the Chinese finally get rid of the outsiders. Well, they bring back Confucianism. And this is kind of important. The Ming Dynasty was tremendously sophisticated, wealthy, all else, not particularly innovative. Their goal was not to create a new advanced future, but to take what had worked for a couple thousand years in China and to reinvent it. Neo-Confucianism honestly plays more of a role in the Tang and Song years, but remember that Confucianism is about the day-to-day. It's about the world. And many Chinese rulers began to realize that people often have a need for spiritual answers. Well, what happens beyond this life, etc. So Neo, which means new, Neo-Confucianism, is adding some sense of a spiritual setting to it. Allowing, depending upon the particular emperor in charge, allowing Buddhism or Taoism to play more of a role as Christianity starts to come in with the Jesuit priests in the 16th century. There is some openness toward allowing that as long as it doesn't interfere with the overall structure of the society. And you see an official move to today's capital of China. Used to be called Peking. It was decided that Beijing is a little bit closer to the Mandarin Chinese pronunciation. By the way, the Great Wall of China goes back 2,000 years, but it used to be piles of dirt and mud and so forth. It was during the Ming and especially the Qing dynasty that the Great Wall that you can see from space, the giant stone embankments, etc., it becomes the Great Wall that we know today. And there's the Forbidden City, just as an FYI. Yeah, it's huge. It's 1,000 buildings. It's 8 times the size of the school that you attend. One thing that's kind of significant, this is where the emperor was, and ultimately with a compound this big, there's a lot of room to hide. And one of the things we'll note is that the later Ming emperors preferred not really to govern so much, but to hang out deep inside with their eunuchs, enjoy their life, basically live the party life as opposed to governing, which led to some problems, which led to some breakdowns in the society, which led people to question, does the Ming dynasty still enjoy everyone all together the mandate of heaven? An exam system, and this was the basis, interesting, it's all based on Confucianism. To memorize Confucian texts, to be able to get a new modern administrative government problem and find a direct quote from Confucius that will provide a proper answer. China prided itself on being a meritocracy. Now you might say, what in the world's a meritocracy? I don't know why you're speaking in a country accent, but there we go. Well, merit means ability, talent, goodness. Krasi, democracy, power of the people, the power in the hands of the most capable. You'll notice about half of the Ming scholars, the government officials, came from at least somewhat modest backgrounds. It was not exclusively the elite. Now you want to say, well, Ziegler, wasn't it a huge advantage to come from a wealthy family and be fed well and have round-the-clock tutors and have family connections? Oh, of course, of course, of course. But if you want to find examples in Western Europe at this time of somebody who was born a peasant serf and became a powerful member of government, I don't think you can find one. So China has always prided itself on that. These exams, Xi, by the way, is a Neo-Confucian thinker, a more modern, as in 2,000 years later, updater, I suppose you might say, of Confucius. I don't think we need to say anything much about him, mostly because I can't. Well, these exam systems, you would spend your entire life, 15, 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, studying and memorizing, working on your calligraphy, and then you finally got your big chance to take the local Confucian scholar exam. And you know what? You probably didn't pass it, but some did. Some did. And if they were talented enough, improved themselves, and kept studying, they would move on to the next level, finally to the national level. These exams would take 3 days. You would not sleep. You'd have water and food brought to you, and you just write and write and write and think. It is estimated that at the national level, about 49 out of 50 of the people taking the exam would not pass it. And this isn't a random selection. This is taking the honor roll from Harvard, Yale, Oxford, and Cambridge, putting 50 of them in the room, and one walks out ahead. It is worth pointing out, however, that 2% passage rate is somewhat higher than for my classes. I don't think we need to say a ton about Cheng Ho because we've certainly talked about him. By the way, also written Zheng He. Again, it's an attempt to take the Mandarin language and put it into English. So Zheng He, Cheng Ho, I have no idea. It's either or both. Again, remember, he's a Muslim, and this is particularly important in today's China. Remember, there are about 40 million Chinese Muslims, and as I speak, there are thought to be over 1 million that are locked up in quote-unquote re-education centers. Call them concentration camps. It's a huge human rights crisis existing as I speak to you. And, sorry for the young men listening to this, he was a eunuch. Yes, he had been willingly castrated in order to take the position that he had within the Chinese government. Now, let me ask you to stop the video for a second. And guys, you can unclench your legs. This is not something I'm going to impose on you. Why would somebody willingly have his testicles removed? And why would that be a requirement in some cases to be a part of the Chinese government? Well, first of all, remember, as you know, there are a lot of things in life. I mean, there are physical pleasures, and that can involve sexual pleasures that a eunuch would not be able to enjoy. But there is also comfort, intellectual stimulation, just simply eating well and living well. And if that's something that the emperor required, it's something people were willing to do. Remember that there was a certain sense, well, not a certain sense, a major sense. If this is what the emperor requires of me, I do it for the emperor. I do it to please the ancestors, etc., etc. Now, why this would be a requirement, often in the Turkish system, because they also used eunuchs, often they were the men who watched over the harems, watched over the women concubines of the sultan. That was not as big a concern in China, but it was largely, look, what do we do with this government official? Where's his loyalty? Is it to his sons and his family, or is it to the emperor? Well, if you are a eunuch, you don't have a particularly large family. You don't really have any sons. Therefore, you are loyal to the emperor and not to your family's private concern. As mentioned, these are massive ships, massive. I mean, far bigger than Columbus's, without question. And look, this is the Pacific, the peaceful ocean. If Zheng He, or perhaps somebody succeeded him, had taken one of these massive ships, pointed it east, and headed toward the Americas, would they almost certainly have landed in North and or South America? It's without question. Of course that would have happened. But remember, in 1433, and this is within the AP World History time zone, remember that the Ming Emperor said, no more. We've done these voyages for the last 40 years. We're not doing them anymore. Now again, stop the video. Why did the Chinese emperor do this? And what do you think the long-term impacts were? Now, starting with the long-term impact, well, clearly it closed off China. Although Ming and Qing China grew, were prosperous, were fairly stable. True, when the Western countries that had access to other technologies, ideas, forms of learning, products, goods, etc., came into China in the 19th century, they had simply advanced far more than China had and were able to dominate China at that point. So in the long term, it does not work to China's advantage, but it's pretty excusable at the time, because from the Chinese perspective, look, first of all, we're working. We have such a developed system, and we manufacture more than anyone out there. I mean, okay, it's cool. There's this tall, long-necked animal with spots that we call a giraffe. That's fun, but there's really nothing out there that we can't make ourselves better. Number two, these are expensive expeditions. And remember, China had recently been taken over by the Mongols. There were the Manchus. There were still Mongol armies out there. The concern was that another invasion could come. So rather than spend the money on these voyages, we need to reinforce our northern borders, which makes a lot of sense. And then also the concern, it's not just there's nothing of value that could come into China. Well, what could come here could be destructive. Foreign ideas, weakening of Confucianism, etc. So it's a very reasonable decision to make in 1433, although you can argue that the long-term impacts did not benefit China. So take a quick look at this man and tell me, where is he from? If you guessed China, you're paying very close attention and would get an A for the day, except you're wrong. His name was Matteo Ricci. He was Portuguese. He was a Jesuit. We'll cover the Jesuits in the next unit, but it was a Catholic order that was committed to spreading the Catholic religion, not only to keep it active in Europe, but around the world. Matteo Ricci came to China in 1582, yes, to spread religion. Now, you know the Chinese would have no interest, certainly the emperor, the imperial court. I mean, barbarians like him were ignored. But remember the one thing that Confucians had valued above all else: education, knowledge, scholarship. And by the time Matteo Ricci comes, Europeans had really learned some stuff that left the Chinese behind about the sciences. This is the early scientific revolution. Astronomy, about the skies. And they began to value the incredible amount of knowledge that he had. And one of the reasons why he probably had more knowledge than a lot of the Chinese is because of good old Gutenberg's printing press, which had been developed further. The knowledge created in Europe is being spread from place to place. So he actually becomes an official advisor to the imperial court. You will notice, in addition to speaking Chinese, a sign of respect, he dresses as a Confucian scholar, which brings him further respect and a sense that he valued Chinese culture. Yes, he was there to spread Christianity, but he began to argue that, you know what, your Confucian ideas, they're not that different. He started noticing that there are ethical, moral systems that are quite similar. Do unto others as you wish to be done to yourself, and respect for people, and don't steal and don't lie. They're real similar in many ways. Ancestor worship. Well, Christians don't really do that. Well, actually, the veneration of the saints, isn't that similar? And also, if Chinese Confucians burn incense or do prayers before the ancestors, that's not necessarily religious. That could just be a thing that we do, like a tea ceremony or just a ritual that we perform. It's not necessarily religious. Oh boy, this idea of the mandate of heaven, that's not very Catholic. Well, maybe it is kind of Catholic. After all, Tian means heaven. Heaven is what we Christians associate with God. Look, is the mandate of heaven just the will of God, which all Christians at this point would have believed in? He has some success, and his successors do as well. Thought to be about 250,000, a little bit fewer Christians, mostly Catholic, almost entirely Catholic, in China by 1700. So, some success. However, a couple things happened. One, Christians began to be seen as a threat by the Qing dynasty, which is in power by this point, and also a more conservative pope. It says, wait a minute, Matteo Ricci and the Jesuits had been teaching that Confucianism could be compatible with Catholicism. No, 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 no. We will not teach that any longer. You either need to convert to Catholicism or you are not a part of our system, and to hell you go. And obviously that was a lot less appealing to a very proud Chinese culture. It's the same story. Once again, the Ming Dynasty, strong, good rulers, good crop development, building up of the Great Wall, building up of the canal system, but eventually the emperors come along after 2, 7, 10, 20, 30 generations. They became simply less able. We know about this over-reliance on the eunuchs, where basically the emperors by the 17th century seemed to be more interested in a good, fun, comfortable life, drinking and playing games and womanizing. The eunuchs don't tend to do a lot of that, but that means more for the emperor to enjoy. You start seeing wars with Japan and Korea, attempts to invade Korea. Japanese pirates are actually coming into China. By the way, if foreign invaders like little tiny Japan are actually sending ships up the Yangtze River, they are actually causing trouble within China. What does that suggest about this dynasty? It may be losing the mandate of heaven. By the way, you start seeing heavy taxation to pay for this elaborate court, to pay for these foreign adventures. The peasants start going hungry. They revolt. A massive earthquake, I want to say like 1610 or 1620. Ooh, that's a sign from the heavens, is it not? Bottom line, there is more and more doubt about the Mings. The final emperor kills himself in 1638, and a few years later, Manchus, people from Manchuria, northern so-called barbarians, come in to crush a peasant revolt within Beijing. And interestingly, the Ming officials, the Chinese Confucians that had lost so much power and influence during the Ming period, they actually invite the Manchurians to come in. Look, we have the knowledge about how to run a pure Chinese society. You have the military power. Come on in. And there's a deal ahead of time. Mandarin scholars from the Ming dynasty that had just collapsed actually work with these foreigners to be able to crush the revolts and start a new dynasty. You can look at this again, but it's the same thing. You can just see the yin and yang here in this little cycle, can't you? So the Qing dynasty lasts almost 300 years. It is the last Chinese empire dynasty. Well, yet. History is a long, long course. It's a long process, especially as the Chinese know. Who's to say that in 2741, after a mere 800 years, a new formal dynasty won't appear, or maybe sooner than that? Some even argue that it makes sense to look at the People's Republic of China, Communist China, as being really the most modern, the most recent of the dynasties. I'll leave that to you. So yeah, again, peasant revolt. Li Tzu Cheng was the name of the leader, although I know nothing about him. Takes over Beijing, and the Qings come in. The Manchurians come in with the help of the Confucian scholars. They become, once again, more Chinese than the Chinese. They adopt Confucianism and then some. Now they use the old Ming mandarins to actually run the administration, to actually administer the exam system, the whole 9 yards for sure. To be sure, the actual emperor was ethnic Manchurian and the very top officials, but by no means did they do it on their own. Yeah, this is pretty close to being modern day China that you see here. The barbarian threat, other barbarians from the north, they're not a threat. They put the Great Wall together. They have the army to keep it together. Look at the population of China. China goes, well, close to 4,000 years, going from the small population in the millions to 150 million. And you know what? In 150 years, they add an additional 250 million people. By the way, a neat possibility, if you were to get an essay question about the Columbian Exchange, let's say you're comparing the impact between the Americas and between Europe of the Columbian Exchange. Let's say you've got about 7 or 8 minutes to go. You think you've got a good essay and you think, how can I score that mysterious final point? If you wish to bring in another part of the world, you could actually score that 7th point. Do the Chinese go to the New World, to the Americas? They do not. Are they affected by it? Very, very much so. A lot of the crops, the potato, the peanut, all kinds of other things that are actually brought from from the Americas to Western Europe, they find their ways to China, to be sure, and it very much allows this giant population. China's no longer dependent on just rice. So it does use those Columbian Exchange crops indirectly. And of course, silver. For better or worse, eventually I think the Chinese would argue worse, the influx of silver into Europe that makes its way to China has a huge impact on China as well. A quick paragraph in those last few minutes in which you say, in addition to the Americas and to Europeans, China was also directly affected by the Columbian Exchange. Provide a little evidence. My friend, you've just scored that final DBQ or LEQ point. Woo-hoo. The two most noted emperors, largely because they were for a long time, you see that there is major spreading under the Emperor Kangxi. This is really modern China, looks about this side. The Qinglong Emperor is especially interesting. Again, you are seeing a very sophisticated, a Mandarin scholar. He's learned, he's a poet, he's an artist. That's something that Confucius would approve of, to be sure. A vassal state. Well, that basically means that although China did not formally take over Vietnam, Burma, Nepal, etc., they became dependent upon China. They largely had to do what China says. You could make a real argument that in the last couple hundred years, most of the countries of South America, Central America, the Caribbean, Latin America, absolutely have been to a degree vassal states of the United States. Now, that was perhaps more true going back a number of decades or a century or more. On the other hand, the United States has expectations of countries in the Americas that they need to ultimately pay close attention to what the United States expects. So China under the Qinglong Emperor is tremendously powerful, largely peaceful, no fears of invasions, prosperous, wealth is growing, etc. And there is the China initially under the Mings. There it is under the Qings, and that's very close to modern China. And now it's time for the harshest letter you will ever read. Any of you have that ability to take yourself and put yourself in the shoes of a foreign personality, please don't do this right now historically with George III of England, because this will make you so sad how you've been spoken to. Now, a little bit of backdrop. England by this point is absolutely growing. It's becoming more powerful. The very early days of industrialization are allowing England to make far more products than ever. You recall that the trading company, the British East India Company in particular, was not only spanning the globe, but they had actually by the 1750s basically become the government of India. So England is developing and growing. And I'll tell you, if you're England and you're making more and more stuff, you want to sell that stuff. You want to trade that stuff. And who better than China with its 400 million customers and the wide range of products that, of course, are made in China that are still very attractive to Europeans. Now, China had not completely cut off trade. Well, first of all, there's unofficial trade, there is smuggling, and that's always going to happen. But what the Chinese had done is they had set up the city, the coastal city of Guangzhou, at that point called Canton, C-O-N-T-O-N, and that was the one place where legal travel could happen. And the foreigners coming in had to register all their goods. They had to stay only a certain amount of time. They were not allowed to just hang out there. They had to pay major tariffs, major importation taxes to the Chinese government. Well, the British government, who is now seeing itself as a major world player, King George III sends, I believe his name is Macaulay, who is an ambassador to China, with an emperor-to-emperor letter from King George, Emperor George III, to the Qing Emperor. And in effect, it said, hey, China, we are two magnificent societies. Why don't we start trading more? We have stuff that could benefit you. You have stuff that could benefit us. Let's do it. Here's the Qing Emperor's response. And again, if you can feel empathy for someone like George III, try to close yourself off. This will break your heart. You, O king, from afar, have yearned after the blessings of our civilizations, and in your eagerness to come into touch with our converting influence, have sent an ambassador across the sea. I have already taken note of your respectful spirit of submission, and I have treated your mission with favor, and I've given it lots of gifts, and I honor you with some other gifts. Thus has my indulgence been manifested. Now, in effect, what I'm reading this ad as, well, I don't think much of people like you. However, you do recognize how incredibly awesome we are. I guess you're a little bit smarter than a slug because slugs might not recognize us. Yesterday, your ambassador petitioned my ministers regarding trade with China. But this proposal is not consistent with our dynastic usage, and we're not even considering it. So, more trade? No. Up to this point, all European nations, including your own country's barbarian merchants, yes, your merchants are barbarians, let's be straight, had carried on their trade with our celestial empire at Canton. That's how we've done it, that's how we'll do it. Because, let's face it, our empire already has all things in abundance, and we don't lack anything. So we have no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians like you. Notice in red, your ambassador has now put forth new requests which completely fail to recognize the Chinese throne's principle that we treat strangers from afar with indulgence. Basically, we'll be polite to you people, no more. And it goes on to say, in effect, so we respect you for recognizing that we're totally awesome. Good for you. No, we're not interested in a deeper relationship, and kind of hints toward the end that if you keep pushing this matter, we may not be so polite next time along. Ouch. Can you imagine asking somebody the preferred sex out to the prom? And the response is, well, I do give you a little bit of respect for, recognizing how awesome and desirable I am. I guess you're not completely stupid, but In terms of going to the prom with you, I have no interest at all. Good day, sir or madam. Good day. Ouch, ouch, ouch. In short, 1793. Let's trade. The Chinese? Why on earth would we want to do that with stinky, pathetic little you? Interesting that the Chinese knew as established fact that they were far, far, far more sophisticated than the British barbarians. Actually, in reality, that may not have been the case by 1793. It was less the case by 1810, 1820. And in 1839, which we'll come upon soon, when the British go to war with the Chinese, it takes the British about a week to completely subdue the Chinese Navy, and in effect, China has fallen far behind the Europeans. It's already close to having happened in 1793, but the Chinese, being so cut off, are unaware of it. And that was the slide that I wish weren't here. I wish I had included it earlier because I had such a dramatic closing to this and the two slides would have, I forgot to move it before I did this. So stepping back for just a second, the Qing social system, it's Confucian. It is clearly set up. The emperor over the people, the national official over the lower official over the commoner, older over younger. I kind of like that one. Man over woman, I don't care as much for that because I don't really care to live like this. If you were to get a nightmare question about gender relations in two different parts of the world, compare and contrast, and the first thing you do is say, oh God, I don't know. One thing you might be able to do is to recognize that in Confucian China, women seem to have an unusually low status. And a big part of this is Confucius. Now, Confucius, to be fair, didn't say, women are terrible, I hate women. It's just simply we have a hierarchy. And as the heavens stand over the emperor and the emperor stands over the people, well, the man stands over the woman. So patriarchal, male control over all females, that's absolutely the rule within China, almost without exception. Your husband was in charge of you as a woman. If he died, his brother would take control, or your sons, etc. Girls received nothing, no inheritance. That's how this was. The purpose behind marriage, create more men. And if in fact, to carry on the family name. And if in fact you were to have 1, 2, 3 girls, female infanticide, killing of the small girls was not necessarily the norm, but it wasn't that uncommon. A widow were often encouraged, like in India, to commit suicide because you're not really helping anything. You are just an additional mouth to feed more than anything. Foot binding was a Qing tradition brought into China, and it's pretty grisly. I mean, this was not just simply you wrap up the feet, but you folded the girl's feet over each other, snapped all the bones, wrapped it tightly, and they just simply, if ever unbound, and this happened in the modern age, they were completely deformed like this. Now, some of this, why? Because small feet were considered attractive. Why were they considered attractive? Because different societies find different things attractive. That's sort of the short answer. The longer answer, though, and you might ask yourself, the question I've often been asked is, well, Ziegler, like, how did the girls walk? And the answer is they didn't, or they walked very slowly and with extreme pain, which is certainly a way of controlling women. So the patriarchy definitely had a purpose behind this as well. By the way, it tended to be only elite or middle class or women of some wealth because the poorer women, of course, well, they had to work in the rice fields and there was no time for anything like this. Interestingly, although wealthier women technically lived in more comfort and they didn't have the horrible work in the fields and everything, they had a lot less independence and personal freedom than, let's say, the peasant woman. And you find that often throughout history. So finally, and this is the one that I wish had followed the Macaulay letter, but I'll change it for next time. What am I talking about? I just spent an hour making this video, and actually, I've already done it once, so it's taken 2 hours of my life, so therefore I will never change it. But I wish I had. Here's the Qing dynasty by 1800. Stable, expanding, prosperous, powerful, trade with the English, good God, no, they're barbarians. But But, and if you want to see a really big but, ooh, the yin and the yang. The end.